Hi. I took the evolution part out of the talk. There's just not enough time, unfortunately. So this will be a little different from, I think, anything you've heard before at this conference. I should probably give you a little background. I'm interested in the development of the capability to produce speech with our vocal tract physiology, and how we learn to control that physiology at a neurological level, or a neural level. And so I guess what I'm interested in is the path from not having speech to being able to produce speech. So to start at the beginning, non-human primates, our closest relatives in the animal kingdom, also produce vocalizations, but they produce really only reflexive vocalizations, like alarm calls and food calls and some social contact calls and things like that, that are patterned in the brainstem, so they're more fundamental than speech is. And the same sound pretty much always maps onto the same contextual information, the same signal meaning, if you could call it that. Humans also produce reflexive vocalizations, such as cries, laughs, and shrieks. But in addition to that, we also produce non-reflexive vocalizations that we have to learn starting in infancy. So these non-reflexive vocalizations include some of the very early sounds that we produce, like gooing and babbling in infancy. And we can also sing and speak. So that's a lot of what we're doing at this meeting, is using this capability that we have. My work is focusing on sort of the very beginnings of emergence of this capability in infancy. So in infancy, in the first year of life, before we actually start producing words, we accomplish quite a few things that form a foundation for producing words and sentences. One of these early achievements is the production of progressively longer and louder sounds. We have increasingly adult-like syllabic timing in our vocalizations. And at about 7 months, infants start what's called canonical babbling, which is like doing things like ba 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 or ma ba, producing sounds like that that have syllabic patterning to them. And that's a major milestone, probably the most noteworthy milestone in early vocal development. And then eventually we start producing consonants and vowels that are similar to those from the language that we're surrounded by. So I wanted to play just a few sounds so you have a sense of what these infants are doing. Just a small sample, but here you go. Here's a vocalization produced by a 4.5-month-old, 4.5-month-old. Okay, so that would qualify as gooing. It's a technical term, it really is, and has some primitive articulation, but it's not syllabic. So then later on in the first year, you start to hear things that sound like this, which would count as what we call reduplicated babble, which is a sequence of the same syllable type produced in sequence. Yeah. So I don't know if you could hear this sort of repetition of the same syllable. And then another technical term that really is a technical term in my field. Later on, infants will often produce gibberish, which is sort of more mixing of different syllable types and with more prosodic contour overlaid. So anyway, okay. So how do infants go from producing just really simple sounds, even simpler than the gooing that I played for you just now, to producing sequences of syllables? Well, one possible source of information that they might use in that process is reinforcement. So when an infant produces a vocalization, does something exploratorily, they often do that in the presence of a caregiver or a sibling. And when they produce something of interest, that caregiver might respond by moving in closer or smiling or vocalizing themselves. And that can serve as a reinforcer to the infant as they are learning to speak. Additionally, infants are probably motivated by just the sensory stimulation that they receive from producing sounds. So there's some evidence from the behavioral literature that these kinds of situations may play out. So why should we introduce computational modeling into this field? There are a few reasons why computational modeling should be particularly important in this area. One is that we're severely limited in the types of experiments that we can do in human infants for very good and obvious reasons. So sometimes in those situations, scientists will try to use animal models like mice or monkeys, which we can experiment with to a greater extent. But in the case of speech development, well, those animals don't speak. They only produce reflexive vocalizations. So we're also more limited there in terms of the appropriateness of animal models. So, well, both of these, there's room to develop science in both of these areas. I think computational modeling has a particularly important possible role. So I'm developing a neural network model that learns to produce new sounds, and it's intended to be a model of the infant as they learn to speak. The network has, it's a neural network model, so okay. There's a single layer of motor neurons. This is really super simple in terms of, as far as neural networks go. And the model goes through a series of learning iterations, starting with, first of all, randomly activating each of its motor neurons, sort of to simulate random exploration. We then do some stuff that implements a local excitation and global inhibition pattern on this layer of neurons, which is important for reasons that I can't get into. And we then propagate activation from the neurons in our model through weighted connections from those neurons to muscles in a simulated vocal tract. So yeah, and then I add a little bit of noise at the muscular level as well. So what's happening here is we're making the model randomly explore its vocal capabilities. So after doing that, we use the muscle activations that are produced as output of this neural network to create a synthesized sound using a model of the vocal tract that I didn't develop, that Paul Boersma developed, that models the human vocal tract as a series of air-filled tubes. So yeah, it's a fluid-filled tube that's bounded by walls of mass spring systems. They're actually more intricate than this schematic figure here. And what the muscle activations that do are change spring constants and equilibrium positions of the masses in this tube. So what the simulator does is simulate the air in the vocal tract at various points in time, and then we take the air pressure at the lips as the synthesized sound. And then given that sound on this learning iteration, we can run that sound waveform through some acoustic analyses to get some basic features like the fundamental frequency of the sound and its first and second formant frequencies. These are sort of characteristics of the spectrum of the sound. And we can use those acoustic features to determine whether or not we should reinforce the model for the sound it just produced. Asking, for example, if the sound is voiced, meaning is this a sound that sounds like a vocalization as opposed to just breathiness or silence? And is the sound similar to the vowels of a target language? So we can reinforce it for doing these things. And then if we reinforce the model, then we can, so in my model, if it's reinforced, then I allow it to learn on that trial. And if it's not reinforced, no learning takes place. So this corresponds roughly to some data from the animal literature showing that dopamine, which is a reinforcement-related neurotransmitter, actually modulates learning in motor cortex in rats. And there's a fairly simple equation that defines how we should adapt these neuromuscular connection weights in the case that the model has been reinforced. And basically, the learning algorithm results in a topographic map of motor primitives that each of these neurons codes for. And then the learning biases the network toward producing similar motor commands in the future. So if the model only learns when it's reinforced for producing certain sounds, then it'll learn to produce those sounds more often. So, okay. So before any learning takes place, we can look at the sounds that are generated by this model. And they sound like this. material to work with there, but a lot of it is really uninteresting, silent and breathy stuff. And then after reinforcing the model for producing voiced sounds, we end up with a result like this. Okay. So yeah, so basically we can get this simple model to learn to produce voice sounds. We can also get it to produce specific vowels. So we reinforce it for not only having to, so we require it to not only produce a voice sound, but also to produce a sound that sounds like ah in order to be reinforced. Then we end up with this. Okay, I always think 25 times is too many, but anyway. Yeah, we can also do the same for other vowels and show that the model can adapt what it does based on what it's reinforced for. And then we can also step away from that toy situation of just having one vowel and ask if you reinforce for producing any of the English language vowels, will you end up with that model producing more English vowels than models that are not reinforced for any particular vowels or reinforced for Korean vowels. And then when we look at production of Korean vowels, we find that a model that's reinforced for producing Korean vowels produces more Korean vowels. So the model's spontaneous productions become biased toward vowels from its native language, which corresponds to findings that this does happen, develop over the course of infancy. So I think to me, that's a pretty simple model. I don't know, what do you guys think? But I'm starting to get interested in using a different type of neural architecture in these models. So I'm starting to use spiking neural networks, which I first started working with on my practicum. So that was a very useful experience for me. And the reason that I'm moving in that direction is that I want to model the development of syllabicity, which is a temporal phenomenon. And so I need to have a model that can produce more temporally sophisticated stuff. So this is sort of a train of spikes in a spiking neural network. This is figure shows some of how this network works, although I don't have time to really explain it. But basically, there is a mechanism for learning in these spiking neural networks, and that learning can be modulated by a parameter that represents the presence of dopamine, which again is a reinforcement-related neurotransmitter. And so what I do is I have the spiking neural network produce motor neuron spikes, which I then smooth out a bit and then input to the vocal tract simulator. I actually then listen to the resulting sounds myself, and then I decide whether or not to reinforce the model for the sound it produced based on whether it has produced something that sounds syllabic. And so here's an example of a sound. These are the motor inputs to the simulator, the vocal tract simulator. And I'm sorry, I'm going to just play that again. So that actually didn't have any syllables to my ear, as you can see in these various representations of the acoustics of that sound. But here's an example where the motor outputs of the model did actually produce syllable structure. So I don't know, could you guys hear that? Okay. So, and you can see those syllables in these acoustic representations. And I can quantify how this does. I sort of actually blind myself to the model, when during learning a sound was produced, and also have a control simulation. And when I'm blind to what model and what time produced the sound, actually the model does appear to learn to produce more syllabic vocalization over the course of learning than a control model. So this is really early stuff, so, but anyway, I'm excited about it, so I wanted to talk about it. And that's really it. Just the work they're doing is looking at whether a combination of exploration and reinforcement modulated learning can be used to shape the types of vocalizations that it produces, or that a model produces, and it appears that it can. I think that, well, this is a very small field, but I think that we are making some headway toward developing models that can address how we learn to communicate vocally. And of course, we want to continue this work and develop increasingly more realistic models. And I think eventually, as we move in that direction, there will be applications to helping us to better understand communication disorders like autism and hearing impairments and things like that. So with that, thank you very much for the fellowship, and thank you to my mentors.